Hey there, ready to dive into John Lewis Gaddis's The Cold War, A New History.
Okay.
We've got some fascinating excerpts here.
Yeah,
And trust me, this isn't your average Cold War history lesson.
you're right.
It's not going to be boring.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the things that struck me right away was Gaddis's argument that the Cold War, for all the tension and fear, it actually led to a more stable world. It's a bold claim, right?
It is.
And he uses some really interesting sources to back it up, like George Orwell's 1984, for example.
Okay, 1984. Why do you think he chose a fictional work like that to illuminate this period?
Yeah, that's a great question.
What does that bring?
I think it speaks to Gaddis's talent as a historian.
Okay.
Because he's not just trying to give us a dry recounting of events. He's trying to get at the underlying psychological atmosphere of the Cold War.
Right.
That ever-present fear of nuclear annihilation, the suspicion, the paranoia that permeated both sides of the Iron Curtain.
Yeah.
It's one thing to read about, Cold War tensions in a textbook,
Right.
but it's quite another to really feel that chilling reality.
Yeah. And Orwell.
And he does that so well.
He really does.
Yeah.
He captures that sense of dread.
And it wasn't just, a war of tanks and missiles.
Yeah.
It was really a clash of ideologies, right?
Absolutely.
Like these completely contrasting worldviews going head to head.
Yeah. And Gaddis does a great job, I think, of delving into the superpowers' post-war goals
Okay.
and showing how those really fueled the conflict.
So on one hand, you have the U.S. emerging from World War II as this global power,
Right.
embracing Wilsonianism, right? This idea of spreading democracy
Yeah.
and containing communism.
Okay.
And that led to things like the Marshall Plan, which was this massive program to rebuild war-torn Europe.
Right.
But it was also very strategic.
Of course.
It was about preventing the spread of Soviet influence.
Right.
Meanwhile, you have Stalin,
Yeah.
who's driven by paranoia and this desire for a buffer zone in Eastern Europe.
Right.
And he's tightening his grip on those countries.
Yeah.
Crushing any dissent.
So you have these two powers with completely different goals.
Yes.
And I think, as you were saying, a fundamental misunderstanding of each other's intentions.
And fears.
And fears,
Yeah.
right? That
Yeah.
just created this climate of suspicion
Absolutely.
that defined the Cold War.
Yeah. It's like they were almost destined to clash.
It's like that old saying, he's fighting a battle in his mind.
Oh, that's a good one.
Stalin just seemed to see threats everywhere,
Yeah,
misinterpreting every move by the West,
exactly.
and ultimately creating the very conflict that he feared.
It's a classic case of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah,
And it had very real consequences.
right.
Stalin's actions in Eastern Europe, for example,
Yeah.
instead of making the Soviet Union more secure,
Yeah.
actually had the opposite effect.
Okay.
They pushed Western powers to form NATO, which solidified the very alliance that Stalin had hoped to prevent.
Wow.
So yeah, a lot of unintended consequences.
It's interesting, though, because, Gaddis is arguing that the Cold War, in a way, created stability. Right, because it forced these two opposing sides into this very tense but ultimately predictable standoff.
Right.
But it was still a period of constant proxy wars and interventions.
Right.
So how does he reconcile that with this argument about stability?
Well, that's where I think Gaddis makes a really nuanced argument.
Okay.
He acknowledges the human costs of the Cold War,
Okay.
the proxy wars, the coups, the interventions.
Right.
He doesn't shy away from the darker aspects of the struggle at all.
Yeah.
He even questions whether the ends always justified the means, especially for the U.S.
Okay.
He cites examples like the CIA's involvement in overthrowing Allende in Chile.
Yeah, Chile, that's always a tough one, right?
It is.
Because it's like, do you compromise your values in the name of protecting them?
Exactly, a classic Cold War dilemma. And Gaddis doesn't let the U.S. off the hook for that.
No, he doesn't.
He really makes you grapple with those moral complexities.
Yeah.
Where the lines between right and wrong, good and evil, they get really blurry.
Yeah.
But even with those interventions,
Yeah.
Gaddis argues that the overarching fear of nuclear war
Yeah.
forced a certain degree of restraint.
Mm-hmm.
The stakes were simply too high for either side to risk a direct confrontation.
It's like they had to walk this tightrope.
Exactly.
Yeah.
One wrong step,
Yeah.
and it could have been catastrophic.
So even in this ideological pressure cooker, there was a level of strategic calculation,
Oh, absolutely.
like an understanding of the consequences of pushing too far.
They both knew that they were playing with fire,
Yeah.
and that kept things in check to some extent.
So that's where this whole idea of a long peace comes in.
Exactly.
Okay.
Because Despite all the proxy wars,
Mm.
the covert actions, or the constant ideological struggle,
Right.
the U.S. and the USSR never actually went to war directly,
Yeah.
which is pretty remarkable,
It is when you think about it, yeah.
given the stakes involved.
Yeah.
So that's the paradox of the Cold War.
Right.
This constant tension, this fear of annihilation
Yeah.
actually helped to prevent things from escalating further.
Wow.
That's the long piece.
We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll continue our deep dive into John Lewis Gaddis's The Cold War, A New History. It's kind of wild how this long piece comes out of what we usually think of as like super tense times. Like so much of what we hear about the Cold War is all about like confrontation and almost coming to blows.
Yeah.
But Gaddis is saying that that tension itself, that knowledge that both sides could destroy each other.
Mutually assured destruction.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what kept things from going too far.
Yeah, it's a bit of a paradox.
Totally.
But those nukes forced everyone to rethink strategy.
Right.
Like some lines you just don't cross.
Exactly. But it wasn't only about nukes, right?
No, of course not.
The Cold War was also this huge ideological battle.
Absolutely.
With both sides thinking their way of life was better.
Totally different visions for society.
We've talked about the U.S. side.
Right.
But what about the Soviet Union? How did their own issues play into the Cold War? Like beyond just Stalin being paranoid.
Right. So Gaddis gets into that too.
Okay.
He looks at how Soviet ideology, especially after Stalin,
Yeah.
shaped their actions.
Okay.
Paranoia was still there. But there was also this genuine belief that their system was better, that communism would win in the end.
Wow.
They really thought they were on the right side of history.
It's crazy how both sides thought they were the good guys,
I know, right?
while also having enough weapons to wipe out the planet like a dozen times over.
It's mind-boggling.
But Gaddis seems to argue that this ideological fight, even though it was risky,
Yeah.
actually had some good side effects too.
Right. He points out that this competition,
Yeah.
this need to be better than the other guy,
Yeah.
led to some positive things.
Like what?
Well, for the U.S., it pushed them to invest in science and tech.
The space race.
Exactly.
Okay.
It also forced them to look at their own problems,
Like what?
like racial segregation,
Uh,
which the Soviets were really good at pointing out, by the way.
yeah.
Right. Of course. Like, hey, you're talking about freedom and equality, but what about this?
So the Soviets were keeping them honest, in a way.
In a way, yeah.
Ah.
And for the Soviets competing with the West, forced them to attempt some internal reforms.
Did it work?
Not really.
Ah.
At least not in the long run.
But the Cold War did have these different phases, right?
Yes.
Times of crazy tension, followed by like attempts to chill out a little.
It's on tape.
It's
Exactly.
Gaddis talks about that too, right?
Oh, yeah. He traces those shifts really well.
Okay.
He talks about détente in the 70s,
Okay.
when both sides seemed to realize they needed to talk more,
Okay.
to be more stable.
Makes sense.
They set up things like the hotline between Washington and Moscow,
Oh, yeah.
a direct line so they could talk if things got really tense.
So no misunderstandings that could lead to,
Exactly.
total annihilation.
They also signed arms control treaties.
Trying to limit the nukes.
Exactly.
Did it work?
Gaddis argues that while détente did some good,
Yeah.
it was limited by that fundamental distrust between the superpowers.
Right. They still didn't trust each other.
Not really.
They were both still trying to be the top dog around the world.
Exactly, vying for influence everywhere.
And then in the 80s, with Reagan,
Right.
things got tense again.
Back to square one,
Yeah.
more or less.
Hardening of positions, a new arms race.
Yep, the Cold War was back on.
It's like this back and forth the whole time.
A dance,
Yeah.
one step forward, two steps back.
But always trying to avoid tripping over the nukes into oblivion.
Exactly, a very high-stakes dance.
And in the middle of all this, Gaddis points out these surprising people who kind of shook things up.
Yeah?
People whose actions and words challenged how things were done.
Challenging the status quo.
Exactly.
And who ended up shaping things in unexpected ways.
Like who?
Well, for example, you might not expect to find a pope in a book about the Cold War.
You don't usually think of religious figures getting mixed up in that.
Right.
But Gaddis makes a really interesting case for Pope John Paul II.
Okay.
Why him?
John Paul II was from Poland,
Right.
which was under Soviet control.
Right.
And he was a huge critic of communism.
Okay.
When he visited Poland in 1979, it was a game changer.
Really?
It galvanized the Polish people,
Mm-hmm.
ignited this spirit of resistance that had been simmering under the surface.
So it's like with all the military stuff, all the strategic games,
Yeah.
it was really the power of ideas
Yeah.
that chipped away at the Soviet system.
Absolutely.
The courage of people like John Paul II standing up for what they believed in.
Exactly. Gaddis emphasizes that throughout the book.
Really?
History isn't just about big impersonal forces in geopolitics.
Right. It's about people,
Uh,
too.
It's about the choices people make, the risks they take, what they believe in.
And those choices can have huge consequences.
Exactly. They can shape the course of history.
Wow.
And speaking of choices,
Yeah.
Gaddis makes this really interesting comparison.
Okay.
He compares the end of the Cold War to the Hongji Emperor's decision to stop China's maritime exploration in the 15th century.
I don't know much about that.
So basically, China was on the verge of becoming a major naval power. They had the ships, the technology, the ambition.
And then they just stopped?
Pretty much.
Why?
It's still debated by historians,
Hmm.
but the Hongji Emperor decided to focus on internal matters.
Interesting.
And just like that, China's age of exploration was over.
Wow.
Gaddis uses this to challenge how we think about the Cold War's end.
How so?
He's asking if maybe we're missing something.
Like what?
Like maybe there were all these possibilities after the Cold War.
Okay.
This chance for global cooperation.
Yeah.
But we just didn't explore them.
Like we sailed right past a whole ocean of what ifs.
Exactly.
Huh, that's a really interesting way to think about it.
And it's a question that sticks with you.
It makes you wonder what we could have achieved if things had gone differently. So we ended up with the Cold War just ending not like a clean break, but more like moving into a world with a whole new set of problems.
Yeah, it's like we went from one chapter to the next without really knowing what we were getting into.
And that comparison to the Hongxi Emperor and China stopping their explorations?
Right.
It makes you wonder if we did the same thing, missed some big opportunities.
It really does. Gaddis doesn't give us easy answers.
Right.
He just puts that idea out there and lets us sit with it.
It makes you think.
That's what's so great about his writing, though.
Yeah.
He doesn't just tell you what happened. He makes you really think about it.
Yeah.
Question what you thought you knew.
Not just about the Cold War, but about like power ideology, the choices we make today.
Exactly. It all connects.
And speaking of choices, one thing Gaddis argues is that the Cold War, as messed up as it was, actually pushed both the U.S. and the Soviets to be better. Which is a weird thing to say, considering all the bad stuff that happened.
It is.
So how does he explain that?
Well, he's very clear that the Cold War had awful consequences.
Of course.
The proxy wars, the interventions, the human rights abuses. He doesn't downplay any of that.
Right.
But he also says that this contest between them,
Yeah.
this pressure to prove their system was best,
Right.
it accidentally led to some good things.
Okay, so it's like this weird upside to a really bad situation.
Yeah, kind of like this pressure cooker of progress.
So what were those good things?
Well, for the U.S., it meant dealing with things like racial inequality and social injustice.
Things they probably wouldn't have addressed otherwise.
Exactly. And the Soviets were all too happy to point that hypocrisy out.
Right.
It forced the U.S. to make some changes.
And for the Soviets,
It showed them how flawed their own system was.
the centrally planned economy, their politics.
All of it, competing with the West, revealed those cracks.
So in a way, they were both holding up a mirror to each other,
Yeah, and neither one liked what they saw.
forcing them to improve.
In some ways, at least.
But what does that mean for us now?
That's the big question Gaddis leaves us with.
Okay.
The Cold War ending wasn't about one side winning the ideology battle.
Right.
It was more like realizing that the world is way too complicated for easy answers.
There's no one right answer.
Exactly.
So what should we do?
Gaddis says we need to talk to each other more.
Okay.
Be open to different points of view, even when we disagree.
Not just assume our way is the only way.
Because there are a lot of shades of gray out there.
No more black and white thinking.
The world is messy, and we need to work together to deal with it.
That's definitely a message we need today.
Gaddis's point is that the Cold War ending wasn't the end of history,
Just a new chapter.
and we're all writing it together.
So listeners, we hope this deep dive into John Lewis Gaddis's The Cold War, A New History, gave you a lot to think about.
It's a book that really stays with you.
It makes you think about those big choices and what they mean for the future.
And what we might be missing right now that people will wonder about later.
Yeah, it really puts things in perspective.
History isn't just something in the past. It's something we're all creating every day.
That's a great note to end on.